Hi, this is Marcelo Aller from BioInsights, and today I'm going to discuss the science of physiological data and how it relates to your health, your happiness, your performance. Welcome to our podcast. I'm excited to introduce Daniel Crumback, who is a exercise physiologist, who is a metabolic specialist, the director of sales for Europe at KORR Technologies, and is a member of the Metabolic Science Advisory Board. Daniel brings 25 years of experience in the field. He's mentioned over a thousand, he's mentored actually, not mentored, he's mentored over 1,000 of exercise individuals from collegiate to professional to Olympians to the average individual around respiratory training. Really, his expertise is in metabolic analysis and physiotherapy. Daniel also lectures at the University of Chichester. Hopefully, I pronounced that properly. I apologize if I didn't. I am a stereotypical American. Sorry. I served 29 years in the Canadian Armed Forces as a physiotherapy officer as well. His mission really is to around metabolic health to transform the wellness approaches in Europe and globally with his blend of scientific knowledge, his sales expertise. Daniel is really always, I've met Daniel many years ago. I've been promoting metabolic training as well. And we've just really resonated really well. Along this journey, I hope that you gather some really meaningful insights. So with no further ado, to get us kick-started, Daniel, why don't you fill in some of the gaps and let me know a little bit about yourself to kind of kickstart this conversation, and then I have some follow-up questions.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. It's always a joy to talk with you. And like you said, we've been talking for years. Back when you were with Polar that was a long time ago.
Yeah.
Yeah,
When I had hair.
Me too. Yeah, so I did, like, as you stated, I did 30 years in the Canadian Armed Forces. I started off like as a tanker. I was a tank gunner and a reconnaissance specialist in the Canadian Army, and then I switched over to being a physiotherapy officer. And then at the end of my career in the military, I was a health services officer and was a commanding officer of a hospital clinic in Edmonton, Alberta, where we had over 400 staff serving 6,000 people. So when I ended my career, went off to China. I was the head of rehab performance, working with Chinese Olympic athletes for 2 years there. And then after that, I did 2 years in Greece during COVID. Not a bad place to hang out if you're going to hang out for COVID. As the head of science and education with PNOE. And then after that, I moved to England because I met a nice English girl in China. And I was teaching at University of Chichester in physiotherapy and physiology, and then moved up north into Cumbria over a year ago, where I continue to run my business, Strategic Health and Performance, and then recently been brought on board with KORR as you said, the director of sales for Europe and internationally. And through my career, I've been doing physiological testing for over 25 years, and I've used just about everything out there, which makes me a relative expert as well, just between the technology and the equipment. So I started off with COSMED. I did lactate balance point testing for 8 years. I switched over to near-infrared spectroscopy with MOXIE and most recently with NOx. I've been working spirometry in relation to respiratory limitations for over 20 years, working with devices like Spirotagger, P100 from IDIAG, and most recently, Isocapnic, the Breathe Way Better device. So the fact that I've had a chance to work and change over the years to a point now where I'm absolutely confident that I have the information I have and I have the right technology, because there's a lot of devices out there right now. Yeah, and it's and there's a lot of exaggeration of the device's capabilities in relation to one of the reasons why I'm with KORR is because they build an extremely accurate and reliable device that you can count on the data, and they give you the flexibility to be able to do your own analysis as well without any after purchase costs or anything silly like that. But it's of all the gear I've worked with, That's the reason why I'm working with KORR now, is
Hmm.
that it's one of the best devices out there.
I think you bring up a lot of things that we can talk about. You've really framed a high level view of the technology that has come out, right? We go back to 2000, really nothing has been innovative except maybe the software side of things and maybe the battery life of things, and maybe the CPU board has improved. Other than that, really nothing new has been happening. The trends in sports, the rehabilitation and fitness industry more or less has still struggled to implement metabolic training effectively. I think there's several ways that we can take this. What I would like to talk about is, how do you feel like the industry still is too dogmatic and maybe looking at things in a either you're an applied specialist who's learned it from someone and this is the way you have to be doing it because that was how you were taught, or that's how, that statement, because I said so, or you have the researcher who has to have a specific controlled environment, and that not necessarily really translates to the field of play or to someone's lifestyle. So do you feel like what's been new, and do you feel like it's still stale, and what does the future look like? So if you can start along those discussion points, and then I'm sure more questions will manifest.
Wow, that's a lovely question. I've had a chance, like you said, to be in the game for a long enough. Okay, let's say probably the most obvious thing I saw when I was teaching alongside, PhDs in exercise physiology at Chichester is the dogmatic approach that universities have towards what metabolic testing is. You used to look to universities for innovation, and I don't think you can do that anymore. I think the innovation comes from the field. So I remember our conversation with my father, who we talked about the difference between wisdom and knowledge. And I think that's the issue. Knowledge, yeah, you can take all the courses, you can have all the certificates. But what develops wisdom is experience with that knowledge. And therefore, if I look at, 30 years of doing this, you'll see how I've changed technologies, how I analyze my data differently than everybody else does, and how the universities do it is because the fact that you just need an inquiring mind. When you have an inquiring mind, you just go, well, what are the other ramifications? What else could be causing what I'm seeing? And physiology is quite complex on the interactions of different systems. So if you look over the years, you'll see that I will always look for multiple pieces of information to be able to make decisions, not one. And I think,
Can
yeah,
you be a little bit more specific? Like let's dive right in to that right there. Like what we've VO2 max, VT1, VT2, target heart rate training. So that's kind of what I've seen on the sports and also in the general public now. Metabolic training, using a wearable, providing biofeedback. Do you feel like that's been implemented effectively?
no, no, I don't. I think we have an opportunity here, but the problem is differentiating those that wish to make a buck off of it versus those that really want to see the science used accessible to everyone. If you look at, I observe a lot on the web about, zone two, zone two, zone two. And my first question is, how are you defining zone two? Because everybody's is defining it differently. I know how I define it. It's at the point in which fat is continuing to contribute a major component to the ATP production and can be done for an extended period of time. So for me, it's a substrate, looking at the substrates and how they're being utilized. And obviously what I want to do is maximize the amount of work that can be done before carbohydrate starts contributing more towards ATP production, because therefore there's a limiting factor of their ability to do this for a certain period of time. So for me, I have a very technical idea of zone two. The problem is that, how you define your zone two, because everybody's is different, is the hard part. And what I'm seeing now is people trying to find really cheap and easy ways to sell devices that will supposedly tell you your zones accurately. And I just don't agree with it. So, people are manipulating the reputation of metabolic analysis is extremely good at being able to zone. So what they're trying to do is state, well, with a really poorly designed device and the right algorithms, they can bend their crappy data and make it look good. And this is what I'm seeing with a lot of devices right now is it's just a matter of the technician in the background normalizing the data to some extent that they're probably going to be right about 20% of the time. And that's the issue, is it confuses the public on what really metabolic analysis is. The other trend you're seeing all the time is that when I talked about a single readout, single set of data, you're seeing people using lactate. Now, I did lactate for 8 years. It only shows you really one thing, and that's when you change a fuel system and lactate production goes up. I hate that word goes up. It's not so much that. Is what it is it's not being used at a rate, so therefore it's accumulating. But who cares if lactate's accumulating? It doesn't limit performance. And this, yeah, but they're using it as a marker for something else happening, which is an increased production of hydrogen ions, which is leading to acidosis at the cell. And you're going, but you don't need that with metabolic analysis. We've got all that data already. But the problem is, if you do lactate on its own, you're just looking for what they refer to as lactate threshold. And we talked about myths. This
facts and fiction, yeah.
This whole concept of thresholds drives me crazy. It's not a threshold. What it is a large increase in accumulating lactate.
Yeah.
And that's it. What you can't do, the only thing you could do with that number is multiply it by a percentage to be able to zone. So it's
fuel utilization, right? You're talking about how you use fuel. My next question to that, and I think it is a good segue, is your fuel utilization, the respiratory equivalent of how you're using your fuel, the training effect. Because I do a test, right? How long are those numbers valid for? Because I think what ends up happening is people either get their zones from an algorithm, pick your choice, 220 minus your age, 208 times 0.7 your age. The margins of error are there, and that's what we're describing, because that might be appropriate at that moment, but then as soon as they start getting fit and their body learns how to metabolize or use that energy a little bit more effectively, those numbers are no longer correct to be using. So those numbers should evolve in a training program.
So
how do you recommend testing?
When I do initial VO2 tests on somebody, I have no idea what their limitation is going to be. I have no idea what their zones are going to be. You have to crush data to be able to figure it out. So, but if you have somebody where you truly identify that they have really bad metabolism at lower energy expenditure, let's say zone 1, zone 2. So you've got to decide what are you going to use to be able to determine that their zone 2 is poor. Therefore, how much attention should be paid for that particular person at that level. So with the use of metabolic analysis and this substrate, the ability to be able to see the fuel utilization itself, you can determine, for example, how much kilocalories of fat they use per minute, right? So if you're looking at somebody who's burning 9.5 kilocalories of fat per minute versus somebody who's burning 3.5, it's an absolute indicator that the person at 3.5 needs to do more work at the bottom end. If they switch from fat to carbohydrate as a major contributor to energy production early or at a low intensity, then we need to expand that zone out. So let's say we talk about that type of person, and I give them a really low zone 2. Like one of the guys I just tested the other day was 98 to 113 beats, almost at walk-in, right? That's all they could do because they had absolutely destroyed their metabolic ability to burn fat and utilize oxygen. Why? Because they had inaccurate zones, and when they thought they were doing zone 2, they were doing zone 3 and 4. So that's the evil part about not having accurate zones. For this person, I would recommend retesting in 8 to 12 weeks, because if they do exactly what I tell them to do, I can shift zone 2 by up to 20 beats in 8 to 12 weeks. So as you said, it must be reanalyzed, and the zones need to be redone. Not only the zones change, but your prioritization of your exercise prescription will change as well. What's really interesting is that when you start somebody who's destroyed their zone 2, they'll find that they're, oh my God, this is horrible. I have to walk really at a slow rate for like 60 minutes, 3 or 4 times a week. And then you say, don't worry, after a week or two, you're not going to be walking slowly within this exact same heart rate. And they go, yeah, all of a sudden I have to walk faster and faster and faster and faster just to keep myself there, as your body starts to make the physiological changes that we're expecting. So that's a long answer to say about 8 to 12 weeks for that person. Now, if they have no major physiological limitation, respiratory, cardiovascular,
that's limiting.
then I'll extend out the how long I test between for that period. So it has to be used as a tool that's logical for your expectation of physiological change, with the idea that that change is going to force you to make changes to the zones or their training or nutrition.
And I just hope that our audience that's listening really understands that ability to effectively impact someone and let them know based on proper testing and fuel utilization, but also ruling out limiting factors that you brought up, because it could be not musculoskeletal, it could be their respiratory system that's their limiting factor. So it could be just doing lung training as well, and teaching them how to breathe. And I think what I've seen now are these trends of zone 2, or learning how to breathe, or breathing through your nose, and training with biofeedback. Before, biofeedback was not a tool. Now you have so many data points. And to your point, I think, if we go back to my polar days, maybe at CES you might have seen 200 companies. Today there's over 1,000. And so the consumer doesn't understand that the metrics that they're measuring are proxies at best. And that's a big thing that I'm like, I just feel like and then if we add the other variable is comorbidities, we have diseases that have increased dramatically. I think what ends up happening, and you said it, is, what's the why are you doing this because you truly want to make a change? Or are you doing this because you're trying to make money?
Yeah.
And don't get me wrong, you have to make money to survive, but you have to also be realistic in how it could be implemented. And I like to hear that KORR actually offers a one-time fee for their software in regards to testing, because in the past, I remember using a New Leaf product that would give me, it was a flow meter that would tell me VT1 and VT2, and we used to implement it with one of our partners at that time was Lifetime Fitness, and we used it with heart rate monitors, and it was just phenomenal to be able to get people in. But the challenge is in the business environment is that not the average employee might not have that skill set. A lot of organizations don't understand, or a lot of business owners, I think, don't understand if they actually have these tools in their business, it'll actually, in the long term, if they develop a proper systems in place, will have better outcomes.
That's why I help.
Let's talk about that.
Yeah, that's why I help. I developed education programming, like you said, that I've taught over 1,000 people, and I continue to teach to this day, and consult internationally with people who do metabolic analysis, but they want assistance with the analysis. If you get to there's a point in which a monkey could do the testing, as long as they were meticulous, right? It's the analysis and the prescription that happens afterwards that is really the most important part. So, testing for the sake of testing, it doesn't make any sense to me. One of my issues is confusing testing and training. I don't believe in using these pieces of technology during training. It's absolutely unnecessary. And what it does, it just bogs down everything.
Because you're not going to change the program right there and then
No.
if you're in a training phase.
Well,
I mean, it's logical, but people don't assume that. They just want to implement it and make the change.
well, yeah, you look at, it's important if you're interested in going through metabolic testing, number one, you need to know, as confusing it is, what do we mean by that? So there's a lot of devices out there right now, and the device quality. So you want accuracy, number one, as a client, and you want reliability, number two, as an owner. KORR has been around for 30 years. That's
Yeah,
outstanding, and their reputation for reliability and accuracy is extremely good. But it's what's in the devices, like the quality of the technology in it, is extremely important. And then on top of that, it's what it actually tests. So be careful if you're going out to be tested with when they only have O2 capability, so only can measure oxygen, because without the CO2 and the O2, you can't measure substrate. So you can't determine fuels, which I think is a real shame. I mean, it's an extremely important part of zoning
yeah,
and extremely important part of training and racing preparation is having the substrates. And the other, of course, is can you rely on the data being accurate? So there's a lot of devices now there's some that are just tiny, and there's no way that it possibly can measure accurately. And if they're using algorithms, and one of the ways of looking at it, it was extremely popular for a while. Everybody wanted breath by breath analysis. And the problem with breath by breath analysis, the first thing they do is slap an algorithm on it to try and make the data look normal.
no,
And whereas if you look at KORR, it's one of the only devices at its price point which actually it actually measures the gases directly in our system itself. So it doesn't do breath by breath, and people go, "Oh, that's terrible," and you're going, "No, it's not. It's actually the gold standard is to actually be able to measure within the device itself and look
yeah,
at how the oxygen and CO2 changes within our chamber itself. So it is the standard for any Douglas bag method that's used at university level. They don't use breath by breath because of the requirement to use algorithms. And every time that you add an algorithm to something, you have to understand that people can play with their numbers to make them look good, but it's not the numbers that they're getting. You just be very careful about if you're going to go get tested, make sure it's a really good device you're being tested on. And of course, like you said, how well can they use the data that they get? And I don't
yeah,
use, as you know, I'm one of the rebels out there. I don't use anaerobic threshold, aerobic threshold, lactate thresholds, ventilatory thresholds. I don't use the thresholds because all it is one spot during my entire test. Why is that particular spot the most important part? And the reason why is people are looking for some reliable point that's easy to identify through an algorithm of which they can multiply by a percentage to give you your zones. Math is not science. You completely threw out all the other data for no reason at all, just so you can make it easy for an algorithm to identify.
yeah. Everyone always, I mean, I went down that rabbit hole for years with trim scoring to look for load management. And started looking for what are the limiting factors, and then went down the path of looking at respiratory. My respiratory muscles are just weak, and then I circled back and realized zone training is bogus. It's just like I was like, for how many years did I promote zone training? I was just like, but if you look at how the industry is, right, from an exercise science standpoint, years ago, we thought that bodybuilding was the ideal way of strength training, to realizing that that's not appropriate for everyone. And I think I'm happy to say that I think the younger generation is asking better questions and is more tech aware. But I just still feel like there's been like an idle time of just not really implementing proper long-term solutions for like weight management or for like because like everyone's like opting for a pill, like, oh, okay, I'll just do GLP-1, and I'm just like, why are we just succumbing to the quick grab of cash as opposed to not listen, GLP-1 has its purpose. I'm not trying to knock it. I'm just saying, why are we trying to go for that as opposed to using, to your point, science and, not selling ourselves short. Sometimes the road that's hard is the right road to be on, as opposed to if it's easy, I don't really feel like that's a right path.
Well,
And
if I can make one other
yeah,
comment, the same
go
thing
ahead.
now. The latest trend I see is oversimplification of physiology, and why aren't we celebrating the complexity of the human body in the first place? The fact is, they said VO2 max is the best predictor of longevity, and you're going, it is one. But the fact is that what we're saying is that people who tend to have high VO2 maxes tend to eat better and tend to exercise regularly. So yeah, the whole construct of that person increases longevity. But I have seen people with horrible respiratory limitations and metabolic limitations with extremely high VO2 maxes. They're extremely unhealthy. And that includes people who are obese, diabetics, all the different populations. They can have a perfectly good VO2 max and be completely unhealthy. What's happening is the companies that put out devices that state they can measure VO2 max, right? Whether they're telling the truth or not, look for a direct measure, as I always say, and then therefore they think their longevity is improved. And you're going, well, you haven't really learned anything. If we look at, Garmin, Polar, everybody puts out your estimated max. It is an algorithm, and it's not terrible that if it's going up, that's good. So even if it's wrong, if it's wrong the same amount each time, at least it's going the right direction. But do you remember back in the days when HRV first came up?
Oh my God, yeah. For me, it's just so misused right now. I was basically a zealot for HRV for many of years. Now I still track and trend it, to your point, and I wrote a blog about it. It's about the trend, folks. Don't look day by day numbers. It's worthless. All you're going to do is behaviorally really torture yourself, and it might be a negative from just where you are, your headspace. You have, so data. My kids mock me. I have toys throughout the house. I measure everything. I just feel like HRV definitely is a value. Nocturnal HRV versus morning HRV, using a mathematical equation to determine a zone two. Dr. Sealer's work. I follow, just like you do. You read the research. You try to look at the p values. You look at the specificity. Did they overspecify? Was it the right sample size?
Right.
Is it representative of everyone?
Now, number one thing is the damn right population. That drives me crazy.
Yeah.
Is the application of so much stuff now in a population that's completely unrelated to the one they're trying to apply to. I mean, if you look at HRV in our day, I was one of the first people trying it. And all I was looking was zone one. That's all I was looking for. But the one thing I realized that was completely independent. Each person's range of their HRV, it can range massively, just based on genetics. So if you don't monitor yourself for a month to 3 months, you don't know what your ranges are, then you can start making some suggestions over time in conjunction with resting heart rate. So, but all you're learning from that is, are you recovered and stress?
Yeah,
that's
it.
Exactly it. You can't apply it to anything else. It's good, especially for athletes that are training extremely hard, but you're going to know about the same time because you're having declines in your performance. But right now, if you look at the amount of respiratory training stuff out there and breathing stuff, that is, my favorite is people that talk to me and go, well, with this research with deep divers, I'm just going, listen, is deep diving breathing or not breathing? And they go, yeah, they're not breathing. It's the ability to hold your breath. It has absolutely nothing to do with how you breathe when you're running or when you're cycling or anything like that. It's a completely different stress on the system, and it absolutely ridiculous application. Same thing with parasympathetic and sympathetic at rest, and you're going, they're not at rest, and there's some other physiological changes that will take priority over them protecting their brain, their heart, their lungs, their organs. The whole idea of nasal breathing just cracks me the hell up because it doesn't make any sense. It's use the big hole in your front and these two ports to be able to breathe because you need to get in as much air as possible. Don't make it more difficult. And they said, well, it slows my breathing down. Well, just breathe slower through your mouth. It's not difficult. So it's but people see a way of making money.
Yeah.
And people buy the books and they try and apply. And then I spend all my time saying, I can see you've read a book on breathing. Stop doing that, because of the fact that you're essentially causing yourself to become acidotic for no reason at all. It's decreasing your performance.
Or get more than one perspective, right? Like I like to see all the perspectives. It's like, looking at every single perspective of this and not throwing out the baby with the bathwater and seeing, is it a valid question? Like we just, looking at the understanding how research is done. That's the most important thing. Like we just talked about, the sample sizes, the p-values. Has it been played with? The specificity of it. Was it a high? What type of filters did they use? And if did that manipulate the data? And so if you really want to go down that path, ask for raw data. My big pet peeve with wearable device companies is you don't give the raw data. And if you don't give the raw data and it's a black box, I'm moving on.
Well, I had that situation with a particular popular company. I contacted them directly and said, listen, I want my people to be able to use the zones that I accurately identified through metabolic testing, but they refused to open up for them to put manual heart rate zones in. Polar does it, Garmin does it.
Yeah.
Apple, you can override, but this other big company, because everything's algorithm based, and as soon as you start playing around with those numbers,
it impacts all their variables. Yeah.
And it's unfortunately become an extremely popular company out there, wearable, and you're just going, look at there's several, yeah, exactly. Several companies are trying to calculate this is your respiratory frequency. And you're going,
yeah.
Thanks. Why do you even try and say that you can do it? They just built an algorithm that was soft enough to kind of get out data that was so right.
I've been asked several times from either researchers or because I've helped develop products in the past, so I could point people to engineering groups, or I can point people to a specific research group. I'm like, if it's not dual band respiration, you're not measuring respiration. And if you're looking at fuel utilization, you got to measure also that. So why are you measuring respiration? What's the purpose of it? Like, if people say, "Well, I can get it through HRV," that's not respiration. That's a proxy at best, and that's not really the true value. So be careful. And I think people are starting to realize it and see like devices for what they are, because I've sold devices for such a long time, and my goal is to try to get people from preventing of putting it back in a drawer after 6 or 8 months.
Yep. Yeah.
And the only way to really effectively do it, I've done it a couple times. I worked with a partner here in the country, in the United States, Lifetime Fitness, that used metabolic carts. New Leaf at that time, they're no longer in business, and they would use Polar because the way you just described it, you can program the zones, you can drive in the zones. So, and they gave you a cardio workout based on those zones and what the goal was, right? More importantly, if you want to lose weight or how you effectively, they were creating better runners or better cyclists. So they would train right before VT2. And they would just try to build that big base, big base, big base. And then they would work standard linear periodization, doing some interval work or some speed work prior to the event. And I think they still are doing that, but there, a lot of organizations now are looking at HRV either through a ring or through chest or through an optical PPG sensor. I've taken a look at those variables and they fluctuate. All of a sudden, I'm at 142 one day to like 152, supposedly being at zone two. It's nowhere near what I've tested with metabolic testing. With metabolic testing, with proper gas analysis, looking at CO2 and O2, like you described, is at best I was 139, so like 152, I'm like, I'm hurting. I feel like I'm laboring more than I would normally. Like, yes, mentally, like I had a sweaty shirt, felt great, good workout, right? But are we making people tired or are we making them better?
Well, logically, this is one thing that drives me crazy is if you work consistently in zone 3 and 4, you will decrease mitochondrial density and capillarization. You will actually start to tear your physiology apart at the cell. And a lot of people don't realize that, and not to pick on anybody in particular, because it's, you look at the CrossFitters, right?
Yeah.
They do short distance, medium, high intensity. They think they do high intensity, but they don't. This is the problem, is they don't do high intensity. They do medium high intensity. So they're not in zone 5, they're in zone top of 4. And if they're doing 3 and 4, you'll poison your 2 and you'll destroy your 5. So, and 2 and 5 are the two things that give you better metabolic health. So they're the ones that will change capillary density and mitochondrial density. There's a new study that came out, and they, again, it's this review of all the data, and they're talking about what causes changes and what's better. Is zone 2 better at mitochondrial density capillarization or high intensity? You're going, why are you guys saying one's better than the other? They're different than the other, but they haven't identified why. You need to do both, because if you ask me, zone 2 gets your type 1 fibers and zone 5 gets your type 2 fibers. And what they're doing is they're seeing changes in capillarization, mitochondrial density, but they're not realizing they're seeing the changes at different muscle fiber types. So my guys will combine 2 and 5 if they can do 5. My 5, the real 5, where they're doing creatine phosphate, and if you can do that longer than 30 seconds, you're not in 5. Okay, so this is the problem. The CrossFitters that say, well, I'm doing zone 5. No, you're not. You did it for 2 minutes.
Yeah.
You did it multiple times. So the answer is, well, you're not, because that's not what zone 5 means. And this is the problem, is we need to define, as usual, terminology is absolute garbage right now. It's the same thing as somebody tells me they do resistance training. You might as well be speaking Czechoslovakian to me. Okay, I need to know reps, sets, load, work to ratios. I need to know, and how many weeks you've been doing it, how many times per week you've been doing it. And the fact is, the science on understanding different load types for different structural changes that you're searching for is still a bit sparse. My favorite was the recent review where we looked at hypertrophy. Loads are somewhere between 6 and 20 repetitions, somewhere between 3 and 4 sets. And people get upset with this, and I'm just laughing and going, no, this makes sense to me. Whereas, if you look at max strength or power, it's more defined, right? And to be able to make those changes, because one's more physiological and one's more structural in the sense of function, right?
Yep.
So if you want to become faster, you got to move faster, right? Whereas to change physiology that we want to do at the muscle level, that tends to be your hypertrophy loads. So all you have to do is know, if you're somewhere in there, is what have you been doing up to now, and change it. Because, of course, we need to provide a different adaptive load. And don't change it every time. This whole thing with people doing different strength programs all the time and not allowing
conjugated method.
Yeah,
we went from not allowing people to dose for a long enough period of time for the body to adapt, because we're bored.
Yep.
More or less. Yeah. So it's like
You can get people into it's easier to run classes and keep them entertained and coming back. Anyway, you're not running a daycare, just for God's sakes, be honorable to the science. Okay. This is not about you putting money in your pocket. This is about actually people respecting you because of your knowledge base and an expectation of being honest about what they're going to need to do to get better. And people just, there's so much out there right now to keep people entertained versus knowing that the adaptive load needs to be applied for a period of time for them to adapt.
Yeah, like you said, like a good, like human body, really, the training effect doesn't happen right away. It's 8 to 12, sometimes longer than 12 weeks. That's a good episodic measurements are important. So maybe taking a look at, in that 8 week or 12 week time frame, kind of like blood work, which people don't do enough. You brought up the strength training. I recently did a podcast with a company that looks at velocity and power metrics and shows that similar to what you get with a force platform, but they advocate for not training everything with a sensor because our industry, again, it's like we'll put a sensor on every rack, and every single strength coach won't like basically just dives right in, and everyone's training at zero point 0.8 milliseconds at this load, and because of these zones, it was never meant to be trained this way. So we're replicating the same era that I'm seeing in the last 30 years. We've kind of just repeated history. I feel like where we can really look at this and maybe kind of frame this is, do you feel, what is the perfect gym or club or um, facility look like to you that would truly be evidence-based, science-based, that can help people in a meaningful way? Like, I signed up a member, or I just brought up an athlete into my facility. What would be the meaningful test to do? And then, do you track anyone continuously? What data point do you use continuously? Because now we have that ability with smartphones and wearables. What does that look like to you?
Um, Ideally, you've got somebody who understands that when the person comes in through the door, they need some baseline testing to determine what programming would be the most appropriate for that person. You listen to their goals, but sometimes you need to re-educate them that their goals aren't in line with their limitations, and you have to be honest about that.
The come to Jesus conversation.
It's a conversation where I want fat loss and the guy's 30 kilos overweight. You go, no, you need weight loss is what you need, and we need to train you so appropriately so that we're going to get the weight loss and adjust your nutrition at the same time. So that's one of those situations. Testing, obviously. So I couldn't tell what I do, what I find after 25 years of testing. Metabolic analysis, number one, number two, number three. It's just gives me the data I need to know about cardiovascular, respiratory, and metabolic systems. And it will drive the determination of what programming I need to give to change their physiology to allow them to be able to be better at what they want to do. So their function itself. So everything's directed toward function, whether it's being able to, walk, lift and walk with their grandkids, whether it's to get off their medications or to decrease their medications, because I work with the medical population as well, or whether it's a performance guy who is consistently finishing sixth and wants to be on the podium. So they're the same population. Everybody's got a goal. So you do your baseline testing. I always do spirometry, which is a big miss. Been doing spirometry for over 20 years in my practice because of the fact that there are people with respiratory limitations that will respond only specifically to respiratory training. But the problem is, in this day and age, everybody's selling respiratory for everybody. You're wasting your time and your money because you are perfectly fine the way you are. I can identify exactly through spirometry and how well they use their capacity during exercise and at rest can determine how I would approach that person and whether that's even a priority for that person. So I'll do that mixed with near-infrared spectroscopy, which measures directly oxygen delivery and utilization at the cell, at the muscle specific to the one that we're looking at.
And you said you're using Moxie or Knox now?
Both.
Both.
Yeah.
And do you just basically use it at the thigh, or is there a specific?
Is right. So you can apply, you can put it anywhere. If it's a swimmer, it'd be more upper extremity, but it could be a back extensor. It could be like anything for kicking as well. But the idea of, again, multiple metrics to compare results to confirm what you're seeing. So if you want to know if a person has a respiratory limitation, you need to know what their capacity is before. So you got to do spirometry. Otherwise, you're jerking people around. And then I do the NIRS to help confirm what I see with my metabolic analysis. And the only other thing I like to throw in there, and this is mainly for the weight loss crowd, is I might do body composition, because I know I'm going to have to battle with them about I'm not losing weight, because for the first 12 or 16 weeks, you're just trying to decrease percentage of body fat and visceral fat to lead muscle mass to increase their metabolic rate. And so therefore, I like to use body composition. The other one is there's a lot of people with that are overweight who have good lean muscle mass. They've been carting that extra 30, 40 pounds around with them the whole time. Imagine you walking around with 30 pounds over your shoulder everywhere. They have good lean mass, but they're all being told to do resistance training because it fits into the gym's idea of getting them in there to increase their lean muscle mass. And you're going, you're wasting your time. This is not where they need to work. They could be metabolically completely unhealthy and should be doing some work on improving their metabolism, but not from the perspective of increasing lean muscle mass. So again, your question is, if I was looking ideally, somebody who takes appropriate baselines to determine what this person needs to achieve their goals, and then also use to determine zones for intensity, as well as expectations of change in their physiology over time, and bring them back on a regular basis. Now, do I do a lot of work with my clients during a block if I design a block of 12 weeks? No, I don't. But I do expect them to report back to me about it. So I just put a person onto a respiratory training program using Breathe Way Better. Had a perfectly fine respiratory capacity. Spirometry was fine. Can't breathe when moving. Like 1.2 liters was a peak VT. When she started with the Breathe Way Better, she was breathing 1.4 liters. She's now breathing 2.7 liters in a matter of weeks, because I knew her capacity was fine. She just doesn't know how to do it. So it was more of a coordination program, and it'll automatically apply to the sport. And part of the reason why is, if you look at history like this, is usually a long history of low back pain. Issues with thoracic or rib fractures or clavicular fractures or upper quadrant dysfunction can all affect your ability to breathe when they're moving, because people don't realize that respiratory system, in particular the diaphragm, has a second major job. It has multiple jobs, including keeping you cool on a hot day. Believe it or not, people don't realize that breathing is part of that, but it's a stabilizer of the spine. And if you're overusing your diaphragm because of a long-term back problem, poor stability, then it's not going to be there for the other aspects, which is your ability to breathe well. So there's that, as you talked about, that just because you see something doesn't mean that that's what the problem is. So I'd say be able to apply the appropriate training program is extremely important, with clear expectations of the changes they're going to see.
Do you feel like that facilities today are delivering that, or do you feel like they're just defaulting to the minimum, like BMI, 220 minus your age, or a algorithm metric to give me the training zones, and then making a person tired, and they might see some goals of weight loss in the program, but then there's no sustainability. They really haven't changed.
No, I nobody has got it right yet, except for the guys that have actually gone into the trouble of to buying like a core product, like a cardio coach, learn how to use it, and are doing individualized programming. Those are the only guys that I would trust. But you got guys that are on the cusp, right? So when I was at University of Chichester, they were trying to sell me a particular company, a heart rate zoning system that could be placed on the wall. Everybody's aware of what company I'm talking about. So that when the teams are working out, and I'm going, does it allow me ability to punch in their individual zones? No. Okay, thanks. Bye. And you look at other companies like Orange Theory, which wants to give you the impression, and they're close in some ways, is the fact that they're using algorithmic zones, and they've got the numbers up there, but the numbers are wrong, and it's a shame. You're getting closer when you do stuff like that. But I've been to top-notch group cycling stuff, cycling training, and
Yeah.
they're still not using the right zones for the individuals, and therefore, they're one person's working in zone 2. Sure, the odds are if there's a zone 2 workout, there's a couple of them where the zones will be right enough, but there's others working in 3 and destroying themselves.
Yeah. I think behaviorally we're using technology effectively. The the intention is not ideal yet. It's getting better. I think that the future is brighter, provided that we ask better questions and that we also lead better. So I would like to say, that people will. I think the future would be a better place if the practitioner could also maybe get reimbursement, uh, or be able to be self-sustaining. Most trainers are not making enough, and they're working 16, 12-hour days, or it's just not successful because the place of business is gyms today haven't changed more or less the last 30 years. It's a membership dues revenue based business, and as much as they want to say they're about fitness or wellness or about making effective change, they still need to deliver on the complete picture. I liked seeing what you brought up as an example with Orange Theory, because I I was there before it was before it was like 10 facilities. We implemented the Polar system into their facilities, and then they sourced their own and developed their own. And I went back to them with a PPG sensor with Mio, and then they implemented that and then sourced their own. But they have now a sports scientist, and I know they're trying to do more with the data. The challenge that you describe is, you have really, they think it's structured data. I think it's unstructured because it's false. Like, it's completely, if you really peel the layer back and say, well, is this really zone 1 for that person? You have the age demographic, you have the gender, but it's just data for now until you do specific energy analysis. And I think the facility that dials that in, I thought Lifetime was doing it quite well. Implementing that. I'm not sure if they still do metabolic testing. I know they still. I think it's still available. So I guess to kind of put this all together and wrap this all up, what are some things that you want to share with everyone? How can they reach you? What are some things for 2025 that you're looking to launch or do that you might want the community to be aware about?
Well, let's see. Like I said, I've just joined on with KORR about 4 weeks ago. So I'll be in charge of international and European sales, but it's quite easy for anybody to reach out to me directly. I'll be releasing my education program online as well, and that's a certification program that takes you through exercise physiology, testing, analysis, and prescription. So the whole idea is I just want people that have devices, metabolic analyzers, to be able to use it. It's all based upon KORR I'll use, because I use KORR, it's through strategic health and performance, the data put up, but it's applicable to any metabolic analyzer. So anybody that wants to be able to learn more about it can take that course. You can reach out to me at dcrumback@korr.com.
Put it in the show notes as well.
If you're interested in talking, I consider myself, and the guys that I've talked to in Europe are going, oh my God, you're not a salesman. Going, no, a lot of our salespeople all came into KORR because of the fact that they all did testing, and we were firmly supportive of the quality and the accuracy of our device. But that everything is going to be moving even further forward in KORR because we have a very dynamic team. The CEO is highly supportive, and we have some cool stuff coming up in the future. For me, like I said, I'm going to be focusing on international consulting as well as my education programming, which, like I said, will be coming out shortly. One thing that I would say, that your last comment, if you can link the data from your metabolic analysis, like you were talking with New Leaf back in the day, and I remember going to Exos to do a rehab specialist mentorship, and they had a New Leaf there. That's the trick. So Cardio Coach has a personal app. What's nice is all I have to do is, after the test, is export the data from their RMR and from their VO2, and it changes their zones automatically. It also changes their substrate utilization to be accurate at rest as well as during activity. So it gives you your accurate caloric burn, your percentage of fat and carbohydrate. The zones change automatically, and therefore you have all of this. And essentially all you need with that, it's a phone app, is a half-decent heart rate strap. That's it. But I'm a big person on all the grumping on technology and everybody wearing technology and overusing the data. Yeah, I agree with you. Training is training and testing is testing. My feeling is heart rate is still the best way of training people because it's physiologically dependent upon the person. If they've had a busy day, if they haven't slept well, if they hadn't eaten well, if they're exhausted, if a cold is coming along, all of those things will change how much work they can do at that heart rate. Whereas if you use wattage or speed, all valuable, I use speed training and wattage training a lot with my cyclists, is that the fact is that it is not affected by other things. So in other words, if you're feeling really crappy and you're supposed to do, 240 watts for a period of time, but that's because that's supposedly your zone 2. If you're lucky enough to do 240 watts in zone 2, then you have that issue on that day. It won't be a zone 2 workout. Whereas, if you use speed for me is a person that has difficulty with turnover, they have poor technique, and I could see that at the end of a test that, the only thing that was limiting you from going further was the fact that you can't run that fast. So I mean, speed intervals for that. Wattage is a huge thing with cyclists and lacks of strength at higher levels during the test. So if I've got them at the top end and I see their coordination going to crowd, yet I watch their physiology still being able to respond, I'll give strength workouts and wattage workouts to those people because their limitation at the top end is related to that. So I think one thing I will say is to keep the technology down to a reasonable amount. And if you have to go out strapped up to a whole bunch of things to be able to do a workout, probably doing something wrong.
Correct. I do it simply because I'm a tech geek and I always do testing or I'm consulting, and I'm trying to verify and then make some suggestions at the end of the day. But it is, I think everyone that's listened to this, I hope, I strongly recommend, if you want to know anything about metabolic training, take the course curriculum. It is an ideal source of information. I've learned from you many times over the years. I definitely feel that it has contributed to my perspective. I've, understood better effective tools and methods. I think that if you don't have a metabolic cart, KORR is definitely one of the standards that I would recommend as well. I would be leery of newer technology simply because accuracy is always an issue. And it doesn't give you, in most cases, the exchange rate that we mentioned on fuel utilization. That's the limiting factor. If I'm going to do ventilation testing, I'd want to know how you're using your fuel substrates, because that's a big part of training, is how you're eating, how you're using it. Thank you so much for taking the time today. If anyone that's heard this has a comment or wants, Daniel to express or to elaborate a little bit more on other subject matter, or wants us to do this again, but wants us to talk about a different topic, please leave that in the comments. I'll add direct contact information for Daniel as well, and to KORR as well. And if there's any other questions, I look forward to giving you my best answer. So thank you again for listening. And thank you again, Daniel.
Thank you, Mitchell. Appreciate it.